Well, welcome this evening to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and to Nebraska Innovation Campus for our second Heuermann lecture of this 2015-2016 academic year. We're very pleased to see you here tonight, and we think we have a great discussion and dialogue ahead for you in the next time period of about an hour and a half. The Heuermann lectures were started 5 years ago by the Institute of Ag and Natural Resources here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln by the generosity of Keith and Norma Heuermann, who are longtime production agriculture and agribusiness people from the south central part of Nebraska near Phillips. We're very pleased. I think that Keith has been to all but one of the lectures that we have had in this series since 2011, and he's here tonight. Please join me in thanking Keith Heuermann, the benefactor of our Heuermann lectures. Keith knows both of our lecturers tonight and has a long history with both of them, and I'll tell you a little bit about how that is for each of them as they're introduced. The purpose of the Heuermann lectures is to bring dialogue and leaders from the world stage to our campus in the areas of food security, agricultural security, natural resource security, rural sustainability, all of the issues that we know are big ones ahead of us in the world as we look out over the next several decades. Our lectures are streamed online live, so we have people joining us from across the region here tonight with us in the Innovation Campus facility, and they're archived online. So I would welcome you to go online to Heuermann lectures and see all of these previous lecturers that we brought to our campus over the last 5 years. Tonight we have a really special opportunity to hear a history of international trade related to agriculture. And we specifically wanted to dwell on this topic because there is a lot of dialogue, as you know, currently occurring for us nationally related to trade and related to a big new trade partnership that we will hear about tonight in the TransPacific Partnership. But we wanted to take a little broader look, if you will, across the history of what we think of as the development of free trade and how it impacts agriculture. Those of us in Nebraska know how important trade is to our industries in this state. Export products from the state of Nebraska, especially agricultural products from this state, make up a huge part of our economy in the state of Nebraska, somewhere around $3 billion in annual trade that comes out of our state, especially in the food and the ag sector. So we understand the importance of this issue, if you will, for us locally here in Nebraska. We're very pleased tonight to have the perspectives of two people who represent a pretty broad spectrum of time in the development of trade, not only in agriculture, but more broadly, if you will, especially in agriculture, but you'll see in their comments tonight, even more broadly so. Many of you are familiar with, through his long history, starting in Eustis, Nebraska, in the western part of our state, Dr. Clayton Yeutter, to my left. Dr. Yeutter grew up here, came to the University of Nebraska where he graduated with highest honors in both agricultural economics and with his JD from our College of Law, and then has had a very long and illustrious career in a lot of different positions and a lot of very important positions related to agriculture and ultimately in a wider sense in our federal government. He was the CEO of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange at one point in his career. He was served as the U.S. Trade Representative during the time that NAFTA was being created, the Canadian agreement and then the NAFTA agreement for North America as we know it today. He served as Secretary of Agriculture of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So he has this illustrious career, deep in agriculture, but more widely in the trade arena that Clayton brings to the stage with us tonight. And then on my right, we have Darci Yeutter joining us, also a native Nebraskan, so we're very proud of the fact that we're bookending this discussion with two native Nebraskans who have meant so much to us in the trade arena. Darci is from the Aurora area of the state. I mentioned that Mr. Heuermann knew them both. He knew Clayton as Secretary of Agriculture and all the positions he said. He said he sold seed to Darci's grandfather and to her father, who is joining us here tonight. So Darci is from the Aurora area, has a background at Drake University, has been involved in the trade arena in Washington the last number of years. We actually had her, she doesn't know I'm going to say this, but we actually had her looking at a position at the University of Nebraska at the time that she was nominated to become the U.S. Chief Negotiator for Agriculture for USDA and the position that she holds today. So Darci is the bookend on the current side, where we're now talking about agreements across the Pacific and agreements across the Atlantic, in addition to NAFTA and CAFTA as it started out for us in the 1980s and the 1990s. So our format tonight is to hear from each of Clayton and Darci, so they'll make some opening comments from their perspectives around this issue of international trade. Then we'll have some dialogue and discussion amongst the two of them before we open up the floor to you and the audience to be able to have questions and dialogue with them in the last 15 or 20 minutes of our time. So that's our format tonight. We look forward to a great discussion. So with that, Clayton, welcome back to Nebraska.
Thank you.
The last thing I'm going to say in introducing Clayton, some of you have heard us talk about this. We're very proud of the fact that due to Clayton and his family and many of Clayton's friends and colleagues through his career, that we're in the process of standing up the Yeutter Institute for International Trade and Finance here at the University of Nebraska, jointly between the Colleges of Business Administration, College of Law, and the College of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources. Dr. Clayton Yeutter.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chancellor, and welcome to everybody. It was wonderful to see a lot of you on the way in. I was trying to get into the room where we were having a reception in there, and I never made it. But it was a wonderful opportunity to visit with a whole host of you. And Dr. Green, I liked all of that introduction except one part. And that was where you talked about the broad spectrum of age differential. You know, what that means is that one of you is awfully young and the other one is awfully old. And it isn't very difficult to determine which is which. And I want to say preliminarily, too, that you all are in for a great treat to listen to Ambassador Yeutter tonight, because she's absolutely outstanding. And you Cornhuskers should be very, very proud of her. She's going to make you proud for a lot of years to come. So I'm going to do my part as quickly as possible so that you can listen to her as long as you want to listen to her. But what we did, the way we decided to handle this was that I ought to try to put what's happened in trade, and especially agricultural trade, in kind of a historical perspective. I always find that it helps me to evaluate a situation if I know what has come before and why. And then you can determine where you are and why and what you do from then on. So I'm going to eventually fade away here and let Ambassador Yeutter tell you where we are and why and where we go from here. But I thought it might be helpful to put this a little bit in perspective. So I'm going to try to do 50 years of trade history in about 10 or 12 minutes, which is a formidable task, but let's see if we can do it. You know, all of this started right after World War II. And at that time, in 1947, the major nations of the world who survived World War II established was called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was just an accord. But they began to kind of put an organization around it and became known as the GATT. And they put it in Geneva, Switzerland. They assigned a director general to it, and they put a little dinky secretariat up there, and that was to run trade of all kinds. Agriculture wasn't even on the agenda at that time. And from then, from the 40s until the 70s, about the time I first came into government, the only thing they ever did was worked on tariff levels. They would, about once every 10 years in that 30-year period, would negotiate tariffs down a bit. They usually used a formula at that point, and they made a little progress on tariffs, but not a whole lot, especially on agriculture, because agricultural tariffs around the world have traditionally been pretty darn high. And if you have a formula that says you're going to reduce tariffs by 10%, but your original tariff is 200%, you haven't gained a whole lot. You've gone from 200 down to 180, but you still don't get any trade. So there wasn't anything very satisfying about all those tariff reductions, which went on for about 30 years. That came up until the 70s, and in the Ford administration, I became the deputy STR, which was the #2 position in trade. And what President Ford said at that time, come on, we need to get some agriculture into this picture. And that's why he invited me to come from USDA over to the Office of the Special Trade Representative to give agriculture some representation. At that time, we were having a hard time with the what was then the European Economic Community, Western Europe, because they were eating our lunch already in agricultural trade. And so we began to attack them pretty aggressively at that time. But we have elections in the U.S., and President Ford went out in the aftermath of Watergate. President Carter came in. There wasn't anybody in the Carter administration that cared very much about agriculture. And as a consequence, we went through 4 years there in which whatever progress we'd made in the Ford administration went down the tubes in the Carter administration. And of course, we had the grain embargo in 1980, as you'll recall, as a part of the Carter administration, which was a huge, huge mistake. Those things were in a mess, trade-wise. That put us into the early 80s. For those of you who are old enough to remember, the early 80s were a tough time for American agriculture. We lost thousands and thousands of farms in the early 80s, and that was partially, at least, due to things going wrong in trade, because our friends in the Western Europe took advantage of their opportunities at that time, and they really did us in. I can remember looking at the chart on wheat exports at that time, and thanks to their export subsidies, just spending massive amounts to buy world market share. The European Union, European Economic Community at that time, market share in wheat was going like that, and our market share in wheat was going just like that. I was at the Chicago Merc then, being out of government, of course, and I said to the Europeans with whom I dealt at that time, this is unsustainable. You guys cannot go on like this. You are pushing this envelope too hard, too far, and at some point the United States is going to react and respond to that. Their reaction was, we don't care what you have to say about that. You're not in the government in the first place. And in the second place, the common agricultural policy is sacrosanct. Their comment was, it is what holds Western Europe together. We are not going to change it, whether you like it or not. And whatever the cost, we're going to pay it. And I thought to myself, somebody needs to teach these folks a lesson. Fortunately, I had that opportunity because President Reagan invited me to become USTR in 1985. And we began a much more aggressive trade policy at that point, not just in agriculture, but in everything. And as some of you who are around long enough will remember, that was when we started the Uruguay round of trade negotiations, which was a big deal because we got agriculture on the agenda, services, intellectual property, investment, and shaping up the dispute settlement system. 5 major objectives that the U.S. had at that time. We got all 5 of them on the agenda as we launched the Uruguay round. That was a significant achievement because just 3 years earlier, in the mid 1982 or 1983, my predecessor Bill Brock, who's a great guy, tried to launch a round of trade negotiations in Geneva. It failed. Everybody came home mad, including all the congressmen who accompanied him. So getting the thing going in 1986 was a major achievement. And about that same time, as Ronnie indicated, we also started the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement and finished that in about 18 months. The largest bilateral free trade agreement in the history of the world. Carla Hills, my successor, added Mexico, and that became NAFTA. And then we also did a bunch of smaller free trade agreements that came in kind of there and a little bit later. That included Panama and Central America and Peru and Singapore and a whole bunch of these, Korea finally. And those proved difficult, though, to get through the Congress. And one of the problems with doing all these little bilaterals, and some of them not so little, is that you expend about as much political capital trying to get them through the Congress as you do a big deal. So some of us said, if you're going to have to expend all this political capital, why don't you do big deals instead of little deals? But this went on for a while, and what happened in the early 90s as people were putting the finishing touches on the Uruguay round and on NAFTA is that we sort of went then into a quiet period for a few years until 9/11. And after 9/11, everybody said, we're on America's side now. And we said, let's take advantage of that opportunity and get a new trade round going. So they launched what became known as the Doha Development Round. And I said to myself, when that name was enunciated, Doha Development Round, I said, it's doomed to fail. And it was, and it did, and it has, because the word development did it in. What that said to the developing countries of the world is that you're going to get a free ride. And there are no free rides. It may be fairly close to free. It may be something less than a full ride. But you can't come into an exercise like that and expect a free ride. And too many of those countries did. As a consequence, the world has spent about a dozen or more years in the Doha round. It got absolutely nowhere until the U.S. demonstrated some leadership here in the meeting in Nairobi just a few weeks ago. Darci will expand on that. And in that meeting, we got an agreement on getting rid of all export subsidies, including agricultural export subsidies, and that's a pretty big deal. That's probably the only thing that's ever going to come out of the Doha development round. But as a consequence of this bad experience with Doha, countries began to say, there has to be another way to do this. Why can't we have something that's less than an agreement with 150 countries? Let's do it with, not 2 countries, but maybe a dozen or so. The opportunity arose in the TransPacific Partnership negotiations, which were just finished, thanks to a lot of great effort on the part of Ambassador Yeutter. That started out as a 4-nation negotiation. We were not a part of that. We jumped on the bandwagon at some point. Some of us worked pretty hard to get Japan into the act because from a standpoint of agriculture, if you don't get Japan into the act, you haven't gotten much. We were successful in having that happen. We ended up with 12 nations, much of Southeast Asia, with the exception of China. That was clearly worthwhile doing. It's turned out to be a heck of an exercise. As Ambassador Yeutter will tell you, it produced a 6,000-page document, the longest trade agreement, I guess, in the history of the world, which may or may not be a good thing. But it was a success story. In closing these agreements, to where you have an agreement is a critical element of this exercise, and we had a success there. The other piece, which Ambassador Vetter will undoubtedly come in on, is so-called TTIP negotiations, which is the free trade agreement negotiations between the U.S. and the European Union. What happened there was that when the European Union figured out that the U.S. was doing this big deal in Asia, they said, hey, we're not going to be a part of that. We're getting left out. We better do something about it. So they became the demandeur, came to us and said, hey, we want to do a free trade agreement between the European Union and the U.S. That exercise is still underway. It has lots of challenges, as Ambassador Vetter will tell you. But the lesson, the historic lesson of what has happened here in the last few years is that we finally decided that maybe a round of negotiations involving 150 countries, including some very intransigent countries, is not the way to go. And we should not put ourselves in a position where we can be held hostage in terms of opening up trade opportunities around the world by countries who don't want to open up trade opportunities around the world. And among the most difficult in that regard in recent years have been the so-called BRIC countries. And as most of you know, the BRICS are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. From a trade standpoint, they've been big troublemakers in recent years. That isn't to say that it cannot change, and Ambassador Vetter may indicate that in some respects it is already beginning to change. But the fact is, we've now decided that maybe we ought to be engaging in negotiations of a coalition of the willing. That is, the people who really want to open up markets around the world. And that's what happened in TTIP, and that's what may happen or happen in TPP, and what may happen in TTIP, and may have some really fine opportunities for the future. That's the history as to how this has all evolved. We're now dealing no longer with just tariffs. We're dealing with a lot of non-tariff barriers in agriculture, which is a major challenge in its own. That's really been true over the last 20 years or so, and it's going to be true from here on. That makes Ambassador Vetter's job a lot tougher than dealing just with tariffs. Tariffs are pretty simple and easy in that respect. But when you get to some of these things like variable levy systems and tariff rate quotas and other things that are really creative ways to impede trade, that becomes much more of a challenge. And Ambassador Vetter, to you.
Before we go to Darci, listening to Clayton can tell you how much investment of time goes into the development of trade. You gave us a very good picture of that, and it goes without saying that Darci has spent a lot of time on planes in recent history, leading up to the TPP agreement this past fall. And I know that she's now spending a lot of time vetting these, hopefully moving forward successfully, that agreement here in the U.S. So I ran into her in Tucson last week. She had just been in Orlando a day or two before at the American Farm Bureau, and now she's here in Lincoln with us tonight. Please welcome Darci Vetter.
And she has a great husband and two beautiful young children, too.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the university and to you, Dr. Green, for inviting me to be here. It is really an honor to be back in my home state, and particularly to share the stage with you, Clayton Yeutter, to be part of this conversation with someone who really set the table for the work that I can do today and helped form the foundation, the institutions that guide the way we all negotiate trade is just really a privilege. So I'm very proud to be here. So you just got a great sort of history in a nutshell of trade policy and an overview of the challenges that we are facing, as well as some of the opportunities we have to really deliver good trade results for U.S. agriculture. And I'm going to take a little bit to talk about 3 of the key items on the President's trade agenda. That is to talk you through a bit about the recent WTO, World Trade Organization ministerial we just finished in Nairobi, what it means and where we go from here. To talk a bit about our progress thus far in that TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership agreement we're pursuing with Europe, and then to spend the bulk of my time talking about the TPP, the agreement we just finished with those 12 Asia-Pacific countries and sort of why it matters and what comes next. So on the WTO front, Clayton's absolutely right that we found ourselves in 2001 in this dynamic where we had created the Doha development round. And what we officially did was created 2 categories of countries, developed and developing. And we all know that within the developing countries, there's a wide variety in terms of the level of their economic development. And during the 15 years that we were trying to fight out how each of those groups of countries were going to contribute, those BRICS countries in particular rose in their prominence and in their ability to influence the agricultural economy. When we started the Doha round, all the pressure was on the United States to curb the use of its domestic support, its ag subsidy policies, to bring down tariffs in the US and Europe and elsewhere. But if you now look, the number 1 and number 2 countries in terms of their spending on agricultural subsidies are China and India. Brazil has risen as the number 1 world exporter of soybeans. We are no longer in a position where if we reach an agreement at the WTO and developed countries agree to cut their tariffs and subsidies but others don't, it's simply not an economically credible arrangement in terms of the impact it would have on the global agricultural economy. And it's not a politically acceptable arrangement either. There's no way that I could take back to Congress an agreement that said, I'm going to cut my domestic support, I'm going to cut my tariffs, but our key competitors in the global marketplace, Brazil, Argentina, India, China, don't have to do a thing. It no longer is an alliance that can line up where the appropriate trade-offs take place. And so what we did in Nairobi is said, what can we harvest from the Doha round? What's still relevant, what matters? And what we were able to do were to get all countries to agree that they would eliminate their export subsidies, developed and developing alike. Now, part of the reason that was politically possible is because the United States already took its export subsidies off the books in the last Farm Bill. And whereas the European Union used to focus very heavily on using export subsidies, over time, as more and more countries joined the EU, they couldn't afford the kind of agricultural policy they used to fund. And so their common agricultural policy reform, CAP reform, has moved them away from export subsidies.
You might pick up your mic and hold it. I think you're cutting in now.
Better? Had moved away from export subsidies and into more ecosystem type payments, more of a direct payment model that we might be familiar with here in Nebraska. And so a lot of the political work, frankly, had been done. But while developed countries were moving away from those export subsidies, we've seen increased usage of those policies in places like India to export sugar, wheat, and some other commodities. So it is important that we took those steps to make sure that countries don't return to those export subsidy programs on the developed country side, and that developing countries start to go through the same conversation we have as developed countries and to change our ag policies more towards risk management rather than an export subsidy model. But Clayton's absolutely right, too, that the frustration of not being able to find the right negotiating formula to go forward in Geneva meant that countries all over the world started doing these bilateral free trade agreements and these sort of regional free trade deals. And right now we are engaged in that process with 2 different sets of countries. One of those agreements is the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. We are less far along with that process. But again, I think the EU, having dealt with some of the key repercussions of our global financial crisis, still facing some of those challenges, particularly in member states like Italy and Greece and Spain, who have significant financial difficulties. They need kind of a shot in the arm. They need to find a way to invigorate the European economy, and a deal with the United States would provide some of that. And when we do these trade deals, they're not just about agriculture. They cover all goods and services, manufactured goods, investment, as Clayton had noted. And so integrating the US and EU economies not only does a lot to stimulate both of our economies, but sends a big signal to the world. One, that the coalitions of the willing are moving forward, and two, that we have an optimistic outlook for invigorating that global economy. So it is important. But if there's any issue that's going to be difficult to negotiate between these two entities, it's agriculture. And so we're looking to use this next year, the administration, to move these negotiations forward as far as we possibly can. But in order for those negotiations to make a difference, we not only have to get at agricultural tariffs, which are far higher in the EU than they are in the United States, but we have to deal with the differences that we have with the EU about how they regulate agricultural products, particularly on the sanitary and phytosanitary, or the SPS side of things. That is the animal and plant and human health regulations they put in place. We have to find a way to deal with trade in the products of biotechnology, where the EU's approval system for those products is slow and infused with a political element that treats our products unfairly. We have to find a way to make that system more timely and predictable, and to let science be the guide in making those decisions. And politically, that's going to be very difficult in a country like the EU. We're also going to need to find a way to deal with our trade in meat products, where they continue to not allow the use of hormones, for example, in the production of their beef. They don't allow pathogen reduction treatments used in our poultry slaughtering process. So we'll have to find a way, again, to allow the acceptance of some of the key methods that we use to produce our products. And I think that's possible. But I think to do that will require a great deal of pragmatism and creativity and political will on all sides, where we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, but we have to find creative solutions that will allow trade to flow, but also allow, I don't think it's realistic to think that the EU is going to change all of their underlying laws. They have to find a way to operate them in a way that allows us to better integrate our agricultural markets. The last issue I would raise is, of course, the TransPacific Partnership. And Dr. Green talked about the fact that he's seen me in other places around the country. A lot of my job right now is making sure people understand the benefits of this agreement to U.S. agriculture and to the U.S. economy as a whole. The TPP agreement is critically important because it has a unique set of economies at the table, and Clayton had touched on this already, but also because on the rules side, it creates the highest standards ever put together in a trade agreement, and it creates a real opportunity for us to raise those standards throughout the region and to influence standards then with others who would like to do business with that region. To just talk a little bit about the opportunities here, we have Japan, which Clayton mentioned was critical to bringing others and drawing them into this agreement. It's a high-income, high-value customer, already our #1 market for products like pork and beef. But they have very high tariffs. They have complicated quotas and administrative processes to get our product in. So it's a place where it's difficult to do business, even though we manage to send them a lot of product. And Japan typically has a number of products that they refuse to put on the table in trade agreements. But the allure of these 12 countries and the depth of commitment they were willing to make to each other allowed Japan to say every product without exception on the table. That includes beef and pork and dairy and wheat and sugar, and importantly, it includes rice, the most sacred culturally of any product in Japan. But they put it on the table, and we have important new access now, or we will if we approve TPP, for all of those products going into Japan. But it also includes countries like Vietnam, who are already important economic partners with the United States for products like corn and soybeans and skim milk powder, commodities that they buy faithfully. 90 million people in Vietnam. But Vietnam is a very rapidly emerging economy with a rapidly growing population, and a population who has more and more of its members joining the middle class. And when people join the middle class, when they have disposable income, the first thing they change is the way that they eat. And so we expect that those consumers in Vietnam will not only continue to be good customers for corn and soybeans and skim milk powder, but they'll buy more of them, as they use them to feed their livestock and produce protein domestically. But Vietnam's a small country. It doesn't have the land or the crops it takes to produce all of that livestock themselves. And so we also expect that we will sell more pork and beef and poultry and dairy products, as well as fresh fruits and vegetables, as the middle class population creates or has a desire for higher protein and a fresher and more nutritious diet. So mature markets, high growth markets all together, reducing or eliminating their tariffs for each other, and at the same time committing to that highest standard of rules that we talked about. Brand new rules on those SPS measures to make sure that when countries implement rules on health standards and animal and plant health standards, they do it based on science, they do it in a way that's transparent, and where we can settle it through dispute settlement in the agreement if we feel that we're being treated unfairly. The highest ever standards for protection of intellectual property. The US economy thrives on our creative energy, and we need to be able to protect that creativity and profit from it. Highest standards ever in this agreement. The highest standards ever negotiated on labor and the environment. We know here in this country we have to meet certain labor standards, we have to meet certain environmental standards. Other countries have signed up through the TPP to enforce those environmental laws, to work with us, to try and address environmental problems like wildlife trafficking, illegal fishing that are directly related to trade, but that have an impact overall on sustainability for all of us. They'll address that through this agreement. And again, subject to dispute settlement, we'll have to meet those kinds of standards. So we think TPP really creates an important platform. And that's exactly what it was designed to be, that we would start with those 12 countries who were that coalition of the willing, both to come together to reduce and eliminate their tariffs, to meet that high standard, and then invite others to join when they are ready to meet that standard too. And in October, when the 12 first members all shook hands with one another, within a week of that, a number of different countries, I believe 8, made a phone call to my boss, Ambassador Froman, and said, when can we sign up? When can we join? And once they saw that it was possible to make that high standard agreement, they want to be part of the party too. But they can't join that agreement until we get it across the finish line and we get it through the US Congress. And that's really our next step, is to work to talk to people like all of you about what the benefits are. And one of the criticisms you sometimes hear about these trade agreements is that people don't know what's in them, that they're negotiated in secret. What I can tell you is that all 6,000 pages that Clayton referred to are available on the USTR website. You could read every word if you wanted to. I don't really see too many hands up about engaging in that activity, but the good news is on that website are also summaries of every chapter and fact sheets about the market access, fact sheets related to Nebraska, talking about exactly what kind of products that we export the most of and how they will benefit. And so I would encourage you to do a little digging to check out what's important about the TPP and how you can help spread that word with your friends and neighbors, because that's how we get this done. This isn't a political issue. One of the reasons I love to work on trade is because it's bipartisan, because the benefits accrue very broadly to the whole population, but it's really up to all of you to kind of tell that story about how trade impacts you, what it means for your pockets, what it means for how then you spend that money in your communities, and how the benefits of that agreement reverberate. And so that's our next challenge, is to formally sign that agreement with the leaders of those other 12 countries and then present it to our Congress for consideration. As we are sitting here speaking, I'm not sure what time it is exactly, the President is preparing, has not started yet, his State of the Union address, and you will hear tonight at the highest level, again, pushing very hard for approval of that agreement this year to really bring those economic benefits to all of you. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Dr. Green.
We're going to have a little bit of open dialogue between Darci and Clayton, and as we're doing that, I would encourage you in the audience, if you have a question or a comment that you'd like direct to Clayton and Darci, please be thinking about that. We will have a time with roving mics in the audience for you to address some questions to them here in a few minutes. So one of the criticisms that we've heard historically about trade, free trade and trade agreements, and we certainly heard that in NAFTA. I can remember that time period well, like many of you can in the room, is fear of loss of American jobs. So that's often one of the very first frontline comments that we hear. And we certainly heard that about NAFTA. Clayton, I heard you make some comments about that last week. Any reflections on that particular?
Yeah, sure, because it's, most of that argument is such a sham. I get really tired of listening to it because it's a part of all this political demagoguery that you hear, especially in presidential election years. I said to somebody earlier today that I just dislike intensely presidential election years because it just mucks everything up on international trade, and it takes about a year to a year and a half to get everything straightened out again. But it happens every time on NAFTA. Everybody says, we need to renegotiate NAFTA. My answer to that is, why do you want to renegotiate what was the most successful bilateral trade agreement in the history of the United States, for God's sakes? That's not the kind of agreement you renegotiate. NAFTA has been a gigantic success. And people say, oh, we lost all those jobs to Mexico. Oh, no, we haven't. There has been no sucking sound to Mexico as a result of that agreement
You don't feel strongly about this?
I do feel strongly, as a matter of fact. But, you know, using NAFTA as an example, when you quadruple trade volumes between and among the U.S., Canada, and Mexico in 20 years, you can't tell me you're losing jobs with a quadrupling of trade volumes. Come on now. There are jobs involved with exports, there are jobs involved with imports, there are jobs involved all over the place. Now, I don't know who calculates these job numbers. Well, I do know who. It's the labor unions who don't like trade agreements, period. But the fact is, that's just pure nonsense.
If I
Darci?
might, I think that in the conversation about trade, we sometimes conflate the issue of globalization as a whole with a trade agreement as a separate entity. And they're not exactly the same thing. And it is true that there are industries in the United States who have faced severe competition from other developing industries overseas, and that sometimes have trouble competing. Maybe we have a higher cost of production. Maybe they have a comparative advantage, which is sort of what trade is all about, right? Is that we produce in the way that we're most efficient. But globalization and increased movement of goods and services and global integration of supply chains, that will happen with or without a free trade agreement. And you know, I will admit, when I first joined USTR, it was on a short-term assignment, and I was kind of skeptical about this whole trade thing. I had some sympathy for all of those arguments. And then I realized, as I started to understand the rules of the WTO, what it was we were trying to accomplish in these trade agreements, not only a commitment to lower our tariffs, but our commitment to be more transparent with one another, to allow an opportunity for notice and comment and rulemaking, to ask countries to adopt rules about better environmental and labor protections. Why wouldn't we, through a trade agreement, want to channel our trade or create incentives to trade more with countries who are willing to raise their standards in that way than simply to leave globalization to do what it will? We can in fact use those trade agreements to help level the playing field, to help raise those standards and reduce both the cost and risk of doing business, and pursue some of our important values like labor and environmental protection. And that's what we're trying to do through TPP. So I don't think we should pretend that if we don't have a trade agreement, there won't be trade. But if we have a trade agreement, there's more likely to be rules-based trade.
And Ronnie, I should add that we have lost jobs in manufacturing in this country. We haven't lost manufacturing production because we're still producing very well in our manufacturing sector. We're just doing it with a lot fewer people working in manufacturing. But that's technology. That's not trade. Our labor union friends like to blame it on trade, of course, but the fact is it's technology that has caused that, and we do have to adjust to that.
So Darci, you talked about the TPP and the excitement around that, around this 12-nation pact, and the need now to move that across the finish line, if you will, in our case through the U.S. Congress. It's an election year, presidential election year, as we know, that we've just entered. So what's tell us about the uphill battle there, or how would you characterize the political landscape relative to the TPP?
Well, I think there's a temptation anytime you have an election year to say we can't do anything that's hard. In the lead up to a presidential election or even congressional elections, people don't want to have to make a hard decision or go on record doing that beforehand. So I think part of the battle is to let the agreement speak for itself and to really talk tangibly about what it means so that it doesn't have to be as hard a decision. It can be a decision on the merits. And I think agriculture is a place where you can run the numbers and show that in fact there's a huge opportunity here. I think the other uphill battle is that it's convenient in the United States, where we try to think just about our own domestic politics, to say there's a world with TPP and the status quo, and that those are the important bits of comparison. And that's just not true. There's the world with TPP and a world without TPP, but that world is moving on without us. Current members of TPP are negotiating amongst themselves and implementing bilateral deals. Almost every one of those TPP partners is also negotiating with Europe for preferential access to their markets. So if we choose not to implement TPP, we will be the country on the outside of others who have given preferential access to each other, and we will miss the opportunity to set the rules of the road for how we do business in that region. I think of TPP as giving us the opportunity to export not just our products, but our way of doing business, the kinds of standards that we like to implement, the transparency we put forward to the world. There are others with competing models out there to TPP, the largest of which is called the RCEP. It's an agreement led by China, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It includes all of our other TPP partners, other Asian countries like India, but you might not be surprised to hear that it doesn't have high standards for the protection of intellectual property. There are not chapters on labor and environment protection. And so if we want to be the country that says, here are the kinds of things you need to do business in the Asia Pacific, we need to lead the way and make sure that we adopt the standard that others will then come to meet. So again, we are currently at a tariff disadvantage already. Other countries are completing deals that will put us at a further disadvantage, and we frankly just can't afford to wait.
Ronnie, that's a really great answer. Can I embellish it a little bit with a couple things? One of the advantages of an agreement like TPP is that there are benefits to those on the inside versus those who are on the outside. And we're on the inside in TPP. So let's take advantage of it. We cannot take advantage of it if we don't have a TPP agreement. Using NAFTA just as an example of that, one of the great things about NAFTA that nobody ever talks about is the fact that it has made these three countries, Canada, the US, and Mexico, a lot more internationally competitive as North America, not as individual countries. But we now have a North American competitive advantage in a slew of things as a result of NAFTA. And that's been one of the benefits, because we're on the inside of NAFTA, everybody else is on the outside looking in, and it's been very, very advantageous. Just to give you one example, Procter & Gamble told me when we were negotiating the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement that they would save $65 million a year, which doesn't seem like much now, but it was a lot of money then, simply by moving things north and south instead of east and west, which they could begin to do under the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement, and they couldn't do feasibly without that agreement. Well, that's the advantage of being on the inside of TPP rather than on the outside. Now, that leads to the next question, which Darci commented on earlier, is that if TPP is approved, as we hope it will, there's going to be what I call a second tranche of TPP negotiations, pretty darn quickly. And she said, these people are lined up. They're calling Ambassador Froman saying, hey, when can we get in? And, there's some excellent agricultural export opportunities in that group. Darci, you ought to mention some of those countries and what their potential might be.
Yeah, very publicly already, Taiwan, the Philippines, Korea, with whom we already have a free trade agreement, but can again even raise the standards of that agreement by having them come into TPP. And just a month after we concluded TPP, the president of Indonesia visited Washington and declared there that they envisioned themselves as part of that TPP alliance. Again, huge populations, a huge economic growth in these countries, a big opportunity.
So we've mentioned a little bit of the elephant in the room through the night in the BRICS, and led by China. We think about China a lot as a big player in the world and a big player in the world agriculturally in terms of market. Do you ever see a day when there might be an opportunity for free trade or an agreement with China? I know it's crystal ball gazing big time.
Yes.
But any thoughts there?
Well, I think what's interesting is that when we started the TPP, when the U.S. sort of joined that original 4 countries that Clayton talked about, China started grumbling, and they said, oh, this is just an effort to isolate us. We're suspicious of what is happening here. But China's public comments about the TPP has changed as we made progress and then we achieved success. And now you've seen publicly some of those officials saying, we're going to evaluate closely what this agreement looks like. If this becomes a model, we could look at this. And so, I think already they're sort of understanding that if in fact this becomes a platform that's large enough, they will want to be part of the group and not outside of it. And again, some of the problems we faced with them on trade, there are provisions in TPP that would help prevent future problems.
And we should add where the BRICS are, excuse me, concerned that things do change. They don't always stay the same. And the example within the BRICS most recently is Argentina. Argentina finally threw out a government that it should have thrown out a long time ago, just recently, and put a pretty darned friendly government in place, and one that is going to be much more oriented toward free and open trade. So there's one brick that may change significantly, and if that happens, you could see that beginning to have an impact elsewhere in Latin America, including with Brazil. Brazil has its own set of challenges right now, but Brazil is not. I never considered Brazil a hopeless cause either. When we did the Uruguay round, we were finally able to bring that to a successful conclusion because we were able to break Brazil off from India, and Brazil finally agreed to vote for the Uruguay round agreement, and that left India isolated, and finally India said, well, we better just give up the ship. It's been a little more difficult in the Doha round because China helped out with Brazil and India. That gave a lot more opposition to what was going on in the Doha round. But I also agree with Darci. I don't think you can conclude that China is going to be out of this picture forever. I hope they're not.
Okay, with that, we're going to open up the floor for questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. We have roving mics on each side. Jesse is over to my far right. Jill is in the center aisle, and we'll get a microphone to you so that we can hear your question. Rick Goodman has a question to start.
Yeah, thank you. Great talks, and I appreciate it very much. It seems I've been working on genetically engineered crops for like 18 years, and then India and China and so forth. In some ways, it seems like the issues of question, people driving, and a lot of it's through NGOs or governments, driving blockage in trade, it focuses on questions of safety that are rather hypothetical, and we have codex and we have guidelines that are supposed to help us reach international consensus about these products are safe, and if it's been grown in the US since '96, hopefully it's okay for India and China today. Is that becoming the next big stumbling block rather than tariffs in terms of agricultural trade?
Okay, go ahead, Darci.
Well, yes, I think you're absolutely right that in many cases these sanitary and phytosanitary rules, these food safety rules, are in fact more difficult trade barriers to overcome than tariffs. I mean, tariffs you can overcome with math, right? You can agree to bring it down or apply a formula. It's much harder. On the biotech front, I think there is a lot of objection that comes in the form of safety, but I don't think the governments themselves are actually that concerned about the safety of consuming those products. I think in some cases they do have still some concerns about cultivating those products and whether in fact they can, there are certain stewardship obligations that farmers have when they grow some of those crops. That's not always easy to enforce or to make sure they're adhered to. So I think setting aside cultivation, I think most government officials, even from governments that disagree with our policy on biotech products, would look at me and say, our scientific authorities are in agreement, but our public isn't there yet. And so they raise the safety question, but it's really more of a question as, does the public think it's safe? In some cases, though, the safety question can be a guise for, we want to develop this industry in our country first, before we let in too many competitors. Or I think the fact that these crops were first developed by very large agricultural companies, that there is a growing sort of public unease about concentration in agriculture. And I'm sure many of you have heard that. And I think sometimes the anti-biotech attitude is a proxy for this attitude, for fear that if products are let in, they'll sort of swamp local businesses or other industries. And so we hear the safety argument a lot, and then you have to try and unpack whether it's really safety or some underlying things. And I think even in the US, we don't do a very good job of communicating the safety. And we've sort of ceded the conversation, I think less so in the US than in some other countries, to the NGO community who has talked about what these things mean. And communicating risk and relative risk and safety is really hard to the general public. And I think we kind of waited too long to be able to get that right on the biotech front. And it's an area where we hope to work with our trading partners to help reduce that resistance.
Darci's right. Government officials, by and large, know better. I mean, that is, they know that safety is not really an issue here at all. This is fundamentally a question of the involvement of activist groups. It's the NGO community. When I was USTR, we had very little involvement with all these different activist groups in the development of trade policy positions. Now they're all over the place. And in Germany, thousands of them demonstrate. They're infinitely more active now, and they're fundamentally just troublemakers. So it becomes a question of whether they have more political influence than those of us who know better. And the fact is, in a lot of areas, they have more political influence than those of us who know better. Now, in terms of the rules of the game, as you point out, we've got Codex Alimentarius, and we've got rules of the World Trade Organization. And the fact is, by and large, in fact, more than that, almost all the time, when we bring a case in the dispute settlement or under the dispute settlement rules of the WTO, and we have a good case, we win. And my personal view is that we, the United States, ought to bring more cases to the WTO in sanitary, phytosanitary issues than we do. Now, when that comes up, as it did, for example, in mad cow disease, the people will say, oh gosh, we don't want to do that. One, it's going to cost us a bunch of money, and two, it'll be 4 or 5 years before we get a final decision out of the WTO, and we don't want to wait that long. Let's see what we can do now. Well, the fact was, they waited 4 or 5 years under mad cow disease and got nothing done. Eventually, it was worked out, but it would have been worked out a heck of a lot sooner had we done a WTO case on mad cow disease. So we got to be careful that we don't forego the opportunity of winning some of these cases and establishing a precedent that has value.
Jesse, I think you have a question here on the.
Wow, that's very loud. To Ambassador Vetter, I had a question about, you had mentioned that in newer trade agreements, they generally have provisions for environmental protection, like to prevent wildlife trading and whatnot. I was wondering if they will also include provisions for commodities that are produced in regions that are facing pressure due to water scarcity and kind of the issues around taking domestic water, producing a agricultural commodity, and then exporting it to another country. Is there work being done to protect domestic water sources, like in California, for instance?
Well, there's certainly a lot of work being done, I think, in the U.S. and elsewhere to look at water conservation issues or to have a good discussion about what is the best use of agricultural land in water scarce areas. But that's largely a domestic decision. And so I think we have to be a little bit careful about what we can do with trade agreements and what are effectively best done through the environmental agencies of those countries or through the agricultural authority of those countries. One of the rules of trade is that once a product is produced, the product should be judged on its merits and equally. The first rule of trade is national treatment, that an import should not be treated differently than a domestic product, and all should be treated sort of fairly in the marketplace. But making sure the way that you designate natural resources, that you are the most competitive, there's a lot of domestic policy underlying that in terms of what incentives you create for production, how you increase efficiency in your countries, and those are largely domestic decisions. So there's not something in the trade agreement per se. What we have done is taken those issues where the actual trade of the product is critical to the environmental outcome, and said that these TPP countries that are agreeing to effectively enforce their own environmental laws, to implement the multilateral environmental agreements they've signed up to, should also be saying, what about the trade relationships between us on those key products in the region, where the fact that we're already working together as trade officials, as customs officials, where we can make a difference. And Southeast Asia has been a hotbed for trade in illegal timber, for example, for wildlife trafficking. Unregulated fishing is a real problem in that area that not only undermines the trade in legitimate fisheries products, but is undermining the food security of small villages that are dependent on healthy fisheries for their food security. And so it's precisely the cooperation among those TPP officials that can have very specific positive environmental impact by focusing on the trade aspect. And so we took some time to say, what are those, and how can we, in a trade agreement, really make a difference by focusing on that?
Clayton?
All I would add to that, and that was a fine answer, is that we've got to be careful we don't put too heavy a burden on trade officials to solve all the problems of the world, because you just can't do that. One of the real success stories in trade is that we've had kind of a manageable agenda in trade policy in the world over the last 50 years. And we've done it pretty well. The fact of the matter is, I think there's been more success globally in international trade than there is in anything else. I mean, look at trade versus foreign policy right now. Foreign policy is a mess in this world. And trade is doing pretty darn well under the circumstances. So let's not muck it up by putting some things in that can be more troublesome than anything else. I'll give you a specific example. It's always been one of my pet peeves, and it came up. It's come up to some degree in the TTIP negotiations, and also in TPP, and that is, do you work on currency exchange rates in these trade agreements? My view has been that you should not. And that's been the view of the trade officials. I can tell you one reason that I don't like that, totally aside from the merits of the issue. I don't want the finance ministers mucking around in trade policy. You know, I want trade policy run by Mike Froman, the USTR in this country. I don't want it run by the Secretary of the Treasury. So let's keep all these blankety blank finance issues off of the trade agenda.
Thank you, Clayton. Mr. Holzfaster, I think, has a question.
We're really awash in commodities, and agricultural exports are really important, especially to Nebraskans, and everybody knows that. But the question I have is, in the magazines I read and everything, they say the value of the dollar is so high, and so the exports are down somewhat. And I wondered how you equate the value of the dollar to the money supply and demand in the world, the yens and the reals and all that, and how does that affect our exports?
Well, it does affect our exports, and you know, we do get hurt when we have a very strong dollar, as we do from time to time. All I would say to that is that, you know, what goes up comes down, and what goes down comes up. You know, this is a marketplace phenomenon, and you know, it's going to, if it's out of line, Ralph, and I'm not saying that it is, but if it is, it'll come back in line at some point. There's been a lot of criticism of the Chinese for having their exchange rate too low. Well, a little while back, they got a little too high, and they had to bring it back down. So, you know, I think these things pretty well work out over time because companies adjust, and sometimes it's really hard to adjust, but it happens. Now, in the short run, where we have a very strong dollar vis-a-vis a lot of these other currencies, you know, I can understand that you know, there's some hurt involved. Brazil, with a very weak real right now, of course, is in a wonderful position, providing they produce anything in all the turmoil that they're under now. But I just don't think you can deal with the exchange rate question in a trade agreement. I think what you have to do, if you can, that is, if you're a company, is hedge your risks. I sit on a Michigan company that does a lot of business in Brazil, and they were slow in hedging the dollar versus the real, and I gave them a pretty hard time. I said, you know, why have you folks been sitting on your derriere watching the real go down? You know, you should have been hedging. Well, we now have a hedging program in place in that company, but they were a little slow, and it cost us some money. Okay.
Fred Bruning, and then we'll come back over to Don Hutchins, I think is the question. Fred?
Thank you both for being here this evening and spending time with us. My question is, with the opening of Cuba, are you currently working on any agreements, and what is the potential for ag products in the Cuban market?
Go ahead, Darci.
Well, I think, first of all, we have taken some steps in the administration to make it easier to trade in agricultural products with Cuba. We've released some of the financial restrictions that were in place about how those transactions can move. But before we can deepen, and of course we have now reopened diplomatic relations, and we have our embassy for the first time there in many, many years. But before we can really restore those relations or look at any sort of deepening of trade ties, we have to end the embargo, and only Congress can do that. But you know, they're 90 miles off of our shore. Their own production of agricultural products is significantly outdated. They need help on the technology side. They need help with, you know, new seed varieties, irrigation technologies. I think if we were to fully normalize those relations, there's a huge opportunity for two-way trade and for investment back and forth that could be realized. They certainly would benefit from an easier flow of U.S. commodities at this point in time that they need to feed their population.
Now, I'll give you the political answer that Darci cannot give you.
Thank you, Clayton.
And that is, it's not about to happen in 2016 as a presidential election year because Florida is too important a state. And everybody's going to try to figure out how to play Cuba in the context of Florida politics. So it's going to get pushed to 2017. But the additional answer is Darci is correct in that the embargo's got to be lifted. It's going to be lifted. It's just a question of how soon. I hope it gets lifted in 2017 by whomever the next administration is. We need to get rid of that thing. Once we do, that economy will explode. I mean, it'll be capitalism all over again, and you're going to see gigantic amounts of investment moving in, not just U.S. investment, but European and Canadian and others as well. And it'll provide some nice opportunities once that happens, and it will happen very rapidly.
Many of you have heard the story of one of our former governors who listened to Fidel Castro exposit for a number of hours, so perhaps it'll pay off. We'll see. We'll see. Don Hutchins.
Well, first, I just want to thank both of you. Clayton, I remember lead one when we came to Chicago and met with you when you were with the Board of Trade, and Darci, your willingness to meet with the commodity organizations, whether it be the U.S. Grains Council, U.S. Meat Export Federation, and all those that are helping us do the job of promoting our commodities. But I guess, Darci, you mentioned something earlier that you would hope that a Congress would view the merits of a good agreement. And I guess you haven't mentioned TPA yet, Trade Promotion Authority, and would you both reference the pros and cons of a TPA and what role it plays between the administration and the legislative branch of helping you do your job of finally taking a good agreement and getting it into U.S. passage?
That's a great question, and I think we didn't really take the time to talk about what is exactly the process by which these agreements are considered. And we were able to pass through bipartisan participation Trade Promotion Authority earlier this year, or last year now. And what Trade Promotion Authority is sort of a deal between the administration and Congress about how you can negotiate the best agreement and then pass it. And essentially, Congress agrees that they will consider a trade agreement once it's completed on an up or down vote with no amendment. And that's important for me as a negotiator so that I can look my colleague in the eye and say, really, that's it. Here's the deal, we're going to shake hands. And so each of us can get to our real bottom line and not be afraid that when the agreement finally gets to the floor of our Congress, that a senator here or a congresswoman there doesn't say, well, I just want a little bit more of this, because that can unravel the whole deal. But in exchange for giving up their right to amend, there are a number of things that TPA requires of me as a negotiator and of the administration as a whole. And the first is that Congress puts together a series of negotiating objectives that they expect us to attain. So it's sort of you're out of the gate, you know, this is the standard you have to live up to. And of course it has very high standard objectives for the elimination of tariffs, for the inclusion of a science basis for sanitary and phytosanitary measures, things like that on the agriculture side. And there are trade negotiating objectives for sort of all of the areas in the trade agreement. And then during the negotiation, TPA requires very specific procedures for how we have to consult with the proper committees in Congress. Myself, I consult regularly with the agriculture committees and with the House Ways and Means and the Senate Finance Committee on the progress that we're making, how it is we plan to achieve those objectives, what trade-offs and timelines we might need to be able to get to the best possible outcome. So members of Congress have an opportunity to help shape the agreement as we go and to give sort of their advice and guidance as the negotiations develop. So by the time we actually shake hands, for those members who have chosen to be engaged, there shouldn't be any surprises. We've been checking in pretty regularly. But TPA also puts in some specific requires for transparency. And so in October, we shook hands and with our 11 other countries and said, this is it, we've reached agreement, we've concluded. Shortly thereafter, the President notified Congress of his intent to enter into this agreement. That started a 90-day clock. And 30 days into that clock, we had to publish the entire agreement, make it available to Congress and the public So for almost 60 days now, all of you have had the chance to start up on that 6,000 pages of reading that you all have to do.
I think there's a message there.
So again, proper time for stakeholders, for Congress, for the general public to evaluate what's in the deal and whether it's worth it. And then after 90 days, the president can sign that agreement with the leaders of the other countries. And we're looking toward figuring out when the appropriate time is to make that signing happen. That 90-day clock runs out in the relatively near future, the next few weeks. Once the agreement is signed, the president can then submit the implementing bill, the bill that Congress would pass, to Congress. And then there are specific timelines for how long each committee and then how long on the floor of the House and Senate that they have to consider it and take that up or down vote. So that is the process that's in place. That's how we're able to reach agreement and then have Congress approve an agreement and not sort of unravel the deal that we've made.
And that's a superb answer, but let me just add one point. As Ambassador Vetter indicated, there isn't time for her to consult with everybody on Capitol Hill, all 500 plus members of Congress. She has to focus on the Senate and House Ag Committees and the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee, which are the two trade committees. So it's those four committees and then the overall leadership of the Congress, meaning people like Speaker Ryan on the House side and Senator McConnell on the Senate side. So there's a relatively small number of people that she has to pay a lot of attention to. But if she does that well, and she will do it on a bipartisan basis, as she indicated, you don't worry about whether they're Democrats or Republicans. You got to cover them all. If she does that well, she will handle the approval of the agricultural parts, at least, of a trade agreement very well indeed.
Last question, Al Swiger, over to our right.
Is this on?
Yep.
As a livestock producer for many years in Nebraska, most of us would like to use the latest technologies that are there, whether it's feed additives, implants, and so forth across the spectrum, to be competitive. Yet many of our trading partners, or so-called partners, rule us out if we want to use some of those technologies. Places like China say, no, you can't use ractopamine and some of these things. For a long time, this has been going on. We've seen very little progress. Are there any answers?
Easy question.
Well, I think there are a couple of answers here. One is that we do want to make sure that our products are being judged based on sound science, and we can work with other countries to try to get them to accept protocols for residue levels. We can make the case to them about why we feel it's appropriate in our country and why we feel safe eating those products. But the other answer is that consumers' interest in how their food is produced and what products were used to produce it is not going away. And whether that's based on science or not, it reflects certain preferences there. So again, I think the restrictions on ractopamine come about for different reasons depending on the country that's there. I think China is hesitant to use ractopamine or allow its use, not because it is opposed to the technology, but because it doesn't want to give foreign producers the economic benefit, the competitive edge of being able to use it, when they don't really have a way to use it in their country and make sure that it's used in a way that is safe, knowing that there are very similar products that can be used that cause very serious human health effects, like clenbuterol, which has been banned in this country for a very long time. And so part of it has to do with China's capacity for how it would use those products. But in other countries, there's a strong consumer preference to know that those products are not used, and so they don't want to allow them to enter. And again, if they don't allow them to enter, then they don't give us a competitive edge that their own producers could not use with political acceptance in their country. So I think ractopamine is just one issue, but there will be, I think, greater need for us to be able to distinguish and adopt different protocols to meet different markets. And that's not to say it's okay for countries to ban them entirely, but that really gaining market share into some of those countries might mean adapting our production technologies to what the consumers there really want.
Now we need to challenge the hypocrisy when it exists to using the European Union as an example. They are signatories to the WTO rules in the sanitary agreement, which say you got to have a science-based system. But they have a precautionary principle system, which is not science-based. Well, you can't have it both ways. Are you in the precautionary principles camp or are you in the science camp? And their answer is, we're in both. Well, come on now. Okay.
Right.
Any closing comments, Darci or Clayton, as we wrap up?
No, I think that's great. Wonderful.
Great.
I wanted,
Thank you.
yeah, let me have one. Mine.
I knew you couldn't do it.
Couldn't resist.
No, this one's for Darci's benefit. And I said this at lunch this noon, and I want to tell all of you, because you should hear it. Darci Vetter is well on her way to being the best agricultural negotiator in the history of the United States.
We
very
certainly
kind.
thank very much, Clayton. This is your second Heuermann lecture. Some of you will remember 3 years ago, 4 years ago now, I believe, when we celebrated the 150th anniversary of the Morrill Act that established the land-grant system, and we had 4 of our former secretaries of agriculture from Nebraska that had a dialogue on the Lead Center stage that night, and Clayton received this medal that night, and he's going to receive a second one tonight for being a Heuermann lecturer. Thank you very much, Clayton. And as Clayton said, well on our way to being the best ag negotiator in the history of the United States, Ambassador Darci Vetter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very kind.
So that wraps up our lecture for tonight. I'd like to draw your attention to the final Heuermann lecture of our series for this academic year. This is the first time that we've announced it here this evening. Will be on April the 26th. It will be in conjunction with the Water for Food Global Water Conference here at Innovation Campus. And we are pleased that Dr. Sally Rocky, who is the new executive director, relatively recently appointed executive director of the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, came out of the Farm Bill, the last Farm Bill, as a new entity in our government working on public-private partnerships and research in this space. And that will be Sally's topic, public-private partnerships to advance food and ag security. So we look forward to seeing you then, April the 26th, joint with the Water for Food Conference. Good night.